Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast brought to you by Bangalore International Centre, where we present conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse.
If you read Iqbal, you will see that he is a very good observer of the European nation state. And his basic argument is that if modernity allows an effective state to be only of that form, then it's a terrible fate to be a minority in that state form, right? In that, I think he's absolutely right. But where somebody could disagree with Iqbal was on this question that why should we accept that simply because that has happened in European history and it has not happened spontaneously. The history of the making of the European state is an extraordinarily violent and bloody history. So Europe was not naturally like that. Europe was made that way, through 200 years of essentially state violence. So somebody could say to Iqbal that, why do we take that, to be something which is the only possibility under modern conditions? Why don't we at least try to devise a state which has a different kind of form?
The thinking on political theory that went into the making of the Indian Constitution was not derivative, but highly original. The Constitution is based on a long tradition of highly original Indian political reflection. This originality lay in the framers' forceful critique against some basic axioms of Western political theory. As illustrations, in this episode of BIC Talks, Sudipta Kaviraj, Professor, Columbia University and Distinguished Visiting Faculty at the National Law School of India University, presents Tagore's thinking on religion and modernity, Gandhi-Tagore-Nehru's ideas of the nation, and Ambedkar's late deployment of Buddhism. Indian nationalist thought also displayed a contending tradition that accepted and elaborated on fundamental Western ideas as in Iqbal and Savarkar. The Constitution sought to develop a state form that was based on a rejection of the European idea of a nation-state, though this is sometimes obscured because the framers used a Western-derived language. Thus, those who believe that the Constitution is Western or colonial are in error, and their search for an alternative is based ironically on an imitation of modern Western ideals. This episode was originally delivered by Sudipta Kaviraj as the M.K. Nambiyar Annual Lecture in November 2023. And now, over to Sudipta.
So thanks very much for the great honor that you have given me by asking me to deliver the M.K. Nambiyar Memorial Lecture, named after a juridical figure that Soli Sorabji calls one of our greatest constitutional lawyers. One can surmise, at least that's the suggestion that I got from Soli Sorabji's note on him, that we owe the phrase, the basic structure of the Constitution in our legal thinking to him. Now, I'm not a lawyer, and so in a certain sense it's misplaced to have me as the first person to deliver the lecture. But I have great admiration for lawyers from the point of view of political theory, because I think political theory, if you do it seriously, is an activity which tends to distance you from the world of political action, precisely because, you want to hold the world of political action off at a distance so that you can set up a kind of critical relationship between you and what you're observing. Lawyers, I think, are not like that. In fact, practitioners of legal thought, because it's also very serious thought about the political and the juridical at the same time. It is, I think, much more at the intersection of theory and urgent questions of social science. So, although I'm not a lawyer, I'm speaking here as essentially a student of political theory, but from a deep admiration for the profession that you have. I have titled the lecture today, The Genealogy of the Indian Constitution, not to talk about the Constitution legally, but to talk about the set of ideas, larger theoretical ideas on which I think the Indian Constitution is based. I want to argue that the Indian Constitution is actually an extremely innovative document in terms of political thought, particularly the political thought that has gone behind it. So this is what I'm going to argue. So genealogy means a family tree the long complex of affiliations, again, in a literal sense of an individual, I fear that the present discussion on the Constitution in our country is sometimes ascribing to our Constitution a completely erroneous genealogy, suggesting that the Indian Constitution is driven by ideas of Western provenance. I want to suggest at the end of this lecture that the Indian Constitution was a remarkable achievement of anti-colonial thought in 1946, when there was not a single decolonized state in the world. The first act of political decolonization from Western imperial power in India was also a remarkable act of intellectual insubordination and originality. But this goes contrary to a view, which I'll take up now, advanced often by authors of great distinction, that Indian political thought, the tradition of analytical reflection that lay behind the juridical structure of the Constitution, was marked either by poverty or by derivativeness. Those of you who have done Indian political thought would recognize these two terms. The first term is taken from a very well-known paper by Professor B.Q. Parikh, The Poverty of Indian Political Thought. And the second term, derivativeness, is taken from, again, the title of a very distinguished and very important book by my friend and colleague, Partho Chatterjee, Nationalist Thought and the Colonial World. And the subtitle of that book is A Derivative Discourse, but with a question mark. Now, there are differences between the two positions, reflecting the differences in the political theory that's actually held by the two authors. Professor Parikh is more of a liberal political theorist, and his objections and criticisms are more about academic political theory in India. So to be fair to the two people that I'm taking up for criticizing, not criticizing really, but to clarify and amplify the question that we are trying to discuss, Professor Parikh's objection is essentially with academic political theory. And he's not making this claim against the great tradition of nationalistic political thought, which is essentially 19th and 20th century. In Partho's case, the criticism is different. He has an extraordinarily important chapter in the book, which is called The Thematic and the Problematic, in which I think Partho touched on something which is very central to my argument today. But after making that point, Partho actually takes a different direction and follows that rather than this point. The remarkable thing in that chapter is that he says that when we look at Indian nationalist political thought, we find that on the narrow question of political sovereignty, the subjection of India to the political sovereignty of the British Empire, on this, all nationalist thinkers are very sharply critical of the West. And there is no hesitancy about the rejection and the denial of that sovereignty. But if you look at their mode of thinking slightly more widely and a bit more closely, then you find that the modes of thinking that they're employing in making this critique of Europe actually depends very, very heavily on modes of thought which they have derived from Europe itself. So this is the paradox that he highlights in that chapter. And I think while the rest of his book went into a discussion of three thinkers, Bankim Chatterjee, Gandhi, and Nehru, I think to some extent, Partho does not pursue that question very much further in that book or in his later work. I want to take it up. And before I do that, I want to make two theoretical points very quickly. Now, this question of adopting a particular mode of thought and thinking with it, I think generally it seems to be plausible, but I think we need to think a little more closely about it. I think any mode of thought, whether it is a doctrine or a philosophical position or anything like that, I think is, with elaboration, it takes on the character of something which is like an alphabet. Alphabet in the sense that the English alphabet has just 26 characters. But everything that has ever been written in the English language, the products of a combination and recombination of all those 26 characters. And I think forms of thought are a bit like that. And you will see why I'm making this point now, because I'm going to argue that one can take an alphabet, and by using alphabet for different types of purposes, it can take that mode of thought in a different kind of direction. I also want to make a simple distinction between, and you shall see later why I'm making this point, it's a distinction between a language in which thinking is done and the content of thought that is produced. So to give you a simple example, suppose we take something like Marxism. It has a particular language which identifies somebody working in the Marxist tradition. But But if you look at Stalin, you say that he uses the alphabet of Marxist thought to approach definitions of conclusions of one kind. And if you look at Gramsci, by contrast, you will see that he uses not the same elements of the alphabet, but different elements of the same alphabet to arrive at conclusions which are very different. So I want you to keep in mind this distinction between the language and the content of the thought, because at the end, I would make a point about why this creates a problem for us. So I'm going to argue against both these readings, that Indian political thought is unoriginal and Indian political thought is not innovative, that Indian thought is actually very innovative if we can do two things. If we can look closely at the ideas which are being presented, and if we also learn to separate, in a certain sense, the language in which the thinking is being done and the content of the thought that is being produced. You'll see in a moment why I'm saying that about the question of the nation and the nation state. I want to give you 3 examples. Probably because of time, I would be able to do only 2. But I'll mention those examples because, this is something that we all think about, and I would invite you to think about the third example as well. The first example is from Tagore, but about the question of secularism, religion, science, and secularism. The second argument, on which I would spend most of my time, would be about the question about developing an idea that I would call the idea of a non-nation state. A state which is a political community, but whose structure is profoundly different, in some ways oppositional to the European idea of the modern nation state. So that's why I rather provocatively call it the idea of the non-nation state, the construction of a non-nation state. The third idea that I thought about more recently was some of the comments that Ambedkar makes about religion and society and the usefulness of Buddhism. That when we think about our own tradition, ancient Indian tradition is not solidly Hindu. The ancient Indian tradition is also equally, if you look at the ancient times, it's also equally powerfully Buddhist. And there's a lot of tension between the Hindu and the Buddhist tradition generally. And also inside, there's a lot of variation inside the Hindu tradition, which I think Ambedkar sometimes underestimates. So let me turn to the arguments now. Now, Tagore is a poet. First, the argument from Tagore. Tagore is a poet, but he's dealing with what I think is the most significant question, one of the most significant questions of modernity. That is, if we accept, because modernity is defined by the development of modern science, if we accept the scientific picture of the world, that the picture that modern science actually gives us about the nature of the world, about causality, why things happen in the world the way they do, etc. What happens to our belief in God? What happens to our belief in religion? Absolutely central to the question of religion, modernity, and secularity. To give you an illustration, just to make the point that he's not touching on something tangentially, which is not very important for a philosophical discussion. This question, what do I do if I accept the picture of the world that science gives us in believing in God? This is a question which is central, let us say, to the work of a very, very well-known German theologian, Rudolf Bultmann, who was a student of Heidegger and who was one of the leading theologians discussing this question. And we can immediately, whether you're a Christian or not, whether you're an atheist or not, no one can deny that in the modern world, if you think about it, there can be no other question which is more important than this, that if I accept the picture of science, can I believe in God? In Bultmann's case, he says, can I believe in the resurrection? That's his question. So I personally feel that Tagore has a very interesting dissenting position on this. If you read Tagore's poems, particularly some of his songs, which are very, very well known to people who are Bengalis, you will find an argument which I think if you put it in a philosophical form is like this. He takes it from the Upanishads. I think he finds the Upanishads interesting because of the basic proposition that when human beings look at nature, the basic emotion or the basic response that comes out of a human being is of wonder. That seems clear and sufficient at this point, but it's not, because we have to push further and ask, what does wonder mean? And I think Tagore finds the Upanishad interesting because he thinks that the Upanishad means wonder in 2 different senses. One is wonder at something which is just incomparably intricate, complex, difficult to understand, right? It is actually the greatest mechanism that exists, and a mechanism which we simply cannot begin to understand fully. So wonder here means something which is cognitive wonder. This is one of the most fundamental forms of wonder. At the same time, Tagore thinks that the Upanishad is remarkable because the Upanishad thinks that aesthetic wonder, how beautiful this is something which is completely connected to the cognitive wonder. Of course, analytically cognitive wonder and aesthetic wonder are very different. We should not confuse between them. But the interest of the Upanishadic position, which is very old, very archaic, and also very primitive in a certain, not in the bad sense, primitive in the originary sense, is interesting because of this. Look at what Tagore does with that sense of wonder at the universe. I thought for a long time that Tagore's position was something like this. This is a position, however, that I have abandoned now. I thought that Tagore agreed with Weber that with the rise of modern science, that modern science actually reveals to us more and more and more the intricate, complex, illimitable sort of causalities through which nature is constructed. As Weber said, the universe is disenchanted. The world is disenchanted. That is, it ceases to be mysterious. Its mystery is diminished by the understanding of causality. So it actually sets up a kind of obverse relation, between the understanding of causality and the experience of aesthetic beauty. Tagore's argument is, I thought at that time, Tagore was saying that this is true, this is what happens, but it's because of this we need art, because we need to re-enchant the world. Human beings cannot live in a world, cannot be reconciled to a world which is totally disenchanted and meaningless. So we re-enchant the world, reinvest the world with meaning, and we can do that by art. So in his case, the art was poetry and music. I have changed my mind on this. I now feel that Tagore was saying something which was more basic and which is more profoundly radical. In one of his songs, this is not just one. I think I can probably give you 20 examples of the same sentiment in his song. It basically says that when I look at the world and I see its infiniteness, I feel grateful that somehow, I've actually found a space in the middle of that, and my music rises from that. So I think what Tagore is saying is, let me put it in a slightly different, more theoretical way now. I'll give you an example which I use in teaching. So if you agree with Weber that if you understand causality, it takes away beauty, it takes away aesthetic wonder, you will have something like this. So I like going to the bank of the Hudson River and look at the sunset. I find it very beautiful. I go there every day. My son is a scientist who works on astronomy. So one day I take my son to the Hudson River and I ask him, why is the sun red at this time of the day? And he gives me a full, scientific causal account of why this happened. I think what Tagore is suggesting is that if Weber is right, then I would actually lose all interest in going back to the Hudson River the next day, because I have understood it causally and it has actually shown it of its meaningfulness, of its beauty in that sense. I don't think that is true. So I tend to agree with Tagore. And whether you agree with Tagore or not, I think it's very important, that's my major point, very important to see that the point that is being made here, it's not tangential, it is not something which is a vague, wishy-washy, poetic remark about the world. It is something which is a deep, clearly articulable philosophical position. And it is my task as somebody who has been trained to be a student of political thought, to put that idea into this language. So this is the first example. I now turn to this second question on which I want to spend most of my time. This is the question of how to construct the non-nation. This is also, you can see, directly inspired by Tagore. Tagore gave those 3 lectures on nationalism. The first one was in Japan. And in that lecture, at one point, he says that unlike the Europeans, we come from the world of the no-nation. We come from the world of the non-nation. So I picked up that slightly awkward word, to put this point sharply. So I think we can safely argue that one of the central certitudes, almost axiomatic certitudes of European political thought, is that under conditions of modernity, if you have to have an effective state, the effective state has to have the form, which is the form of the European nation state. It must have clear boundaries. It must have an identifiable people. Interestingly, some of the developments in democratic thought, for instance, the idea of popular sovereignty, it's not the monarch who is the sovereign, but it's the people who are the sovereign, etc. They depend logically on this prior idea of an identifiable people, right? So a people who is homogeneous in terms of their religion, their culture, their language, etc., right? And that state is the only possible state under modern conditions. Important to stress that point. That's the state which is the only possible effective state under modern conditions. You cannot have a state, a political community, which is effective, which is morally justifiable, etc., under modern conditions, if it does not have that form. Now, all Indian political thinkers from the 19th century, they faced both the power of this theoretical elaboration. They were going to colleges where they're continuously reading European political thought from Hobbes to Hegel, Marx, etc. And this is the substance, in a certain sense, of that theoretical tradition. They're also seeing this being played out in history. In fact, they're asking the question, why is it that such a small number of people from such a distant nation was able to colonize a country like ours? And the answer to that is the prevalence of the nation state. They are organized in a certain way, which we are not. And this is what actually gives them the power. So the modern nation state impresses them in these two ways, in the world of ideas and also in the world of history. So both these things actually seem to confirm to them the presence, I would not say the validity, you'll see why, the presence of this kind of theoretical position, which is the central certitude of Western political theory. I think Indian thought develops two traditions of responding to this idea. One accepts this as fate. One accepts that the logic of modernity is such that if you want a state, if you want that state to be successful, that's the only form in which you can produce this state or construct this state. And so that tradition accepts this as fate, wants to learn it, learn how to do it, and wants to be good at it. Somewhat like Japan. I think there's a very similar tradition of thinking and acting in Japan. But that's not the only tradition. And you might be surprised, probably not surprised, at the mention of the two people, I think, who are paradigmatic examples of this. One is Iqbal, and the other one is Savarkar. There's another tradition which rejects this as fate and tries slowly, through a new parampara. I'm using the term parampara in the literal sense. It is something, which actually hands the thought from one particular person to another, etc. And I think that is the tradition that we find in Indian political thought on this side, also on the other side, but more on this side. To develop a model of a state which is a non-nation state, that is a state which is not like the European nation state. So I'll now give you just some major points of this parampara. I personally find this for the first time in the work of somebody called Bhudev Mukhopadhyay. I'm a great admirer of Bhudev on this point. Bhudev is a conservative Hindu, so I obviously do not agree with Bhudev in everything. But this is something on which I think he has something which is really, really valuable. In Bhudev, what I seem to find is, probably some of you might say that I'm actually putting my words into Bhudev's mouth, which is partly true, but this is something that you have to do if you do this kind of political theory. But basically, I think what this tradition says is that there are two ways in which you can think of the political community and what you can base the political community on. The political community must have a base, right? It must have a structural base. Most importantly, it must actually have an affective base, right? And there are two ways in which you can affectively base the political community. The central concept of the first tradition is blood. Blood meaning we come from the same race, we're the same people, etc., etc. And Bhudev is also conscious, this is why I admire him. He takes this up and he also reveals how the idea of blood, which is extremely powerful, very, very powerful. It's one of the most powerful, human ideas. It has a very powerful ancient medieval form. It also has an equal powerful modern form. Look at the blood that is being spilled in Gaza and think of the idea for which this blood is being spilled. And it's being spilled for blood. In fact, the great idea on both the sides is blood, right? But Bhudev thinks that it's a very powerful idea, but it also has a very peculiar character. The more you elaborate the idea, the more you extend the idea, it actually becomes weaker. And after some time, it crosses a boundary and becomes fictitious, right? So if I say that I'm a Hindu or whatever, any identity of this kind, which is a blood-related identity, the further you go, you will find that you are actually seeing a connection between two people or between different types of people, where the real connection is actually quite weak. It is something that you are imposing, through this kind of blood imagination. So he would say that, for instance, if I say that, I feel a very, very strong unity with somebody who comes from Madras or who comes from Chennai, sorry. So the thing would be that I can feel a strong unity with him. But if I try to base it on blood, this is something which would be immediately suspect, that, what do we share in terms of blood? And the European argument about the nation state, particularly the German state thinking about the nation, the ethnic thinking of the nation, not the more Republican understanding of the nation, but the ethnic thinking about the nation is very deeply invested in this. Now, after finding that argument suspect, Bhudev does something which I think is very interesting. He looks for an alternative affective base, for human bonding, which can form the base of the political community. And that connection is the connection of neighborliness, not my brother, right, but my neighbor. That is, not somebody who has been made close to me or next to me, close to me or next to me. But close and next are not identical concepts. I'll separate them in a moment. So somebody who is placed next to me, you can think of three agencies which has placed him next to me. You can think, if you're a religious person deeply, you can say God has placed him next to me. He can be a good neighbor, bad neighbor. I might actually hate him or I might love him as my family. It doesn't matter. But God has placed him next to me. You can say that nature has placed him next to me. If you were like me, I would say history has placed him next to me. So whoever has placed him next to me, that is actually the base on which we really develop human bonding, human connections, interdependence, and obligation. And I think that, this is one of the fundamental separations or conflicts in Indian thought on this central question about the relation between the nation and the state. So this second tradition wants a state under modern conditions of modernity, so it needs to be an effective state, right? But they believe that they should not actually look for a state, which is the replication of the European state. I wanted to make a couple of slightly tangential remarks because I mentioned Savarkar. Well, let me make a point about Iqbal first. If you read Iqbal, you will see that he's a very good observer of the European nation state. And his basic argument is that if modernity allows an effective state to be only of that form, then it's a terrible fate to be a minority in that state form, right? In that, I think he's absolutely right. But where somebody could disagree with Iqbal was on this question that why should we accept that simply because that has happened in European history, and it has not happened spontaneously. The history of the making of the European state is an extraordinarily violent and bloody history. So Europe was not naturally like that. Europe was made that way, through 200 years of essentially state violence. So somebody could say to Iqbal that, why do we take that, to be something which is the only possibility under modern conditions? Why don't we at least try to devise a state which has a different kind of form? Now, Iqbal does not take that line. And because of that, my thinking is that if you do not take that line, then of course you will either say that I'm a majority in this state and I'm comfortable and secure. And anybody who is not a majority in that state would actually say that I would leave. I cannot be ever secure in this state, not even with democracy, not even with constitution. Nothing can make me secure in this state. We shall be like Jews in European states in the 19th century. And so therefore, what is your solution? You must make a state where you are a majority. And the fallacy of that argument is that if you create a state where you are a majority, there would be people who are not parts of the majority, and they would immediately start thinking like that. So there's a kind of cascading effect of that kind of logic, if you think that way. I find some things interesting in Savarkar. This is not a Savarkar lecture, so I don't want to dwell on that. But I find, for instance, Savarkar's treatment of the Buddha, or let me make a point very generally about Savarkar. I feel that what Savarkar does is that he's so impressed by the logic of modern European thought that he not merely applies it to the present and to the historical period of modernity. He anachronistically applies the notion of the nation, into the past. So for him, the whole of history, which whole of history is not modern history. And if you agree with me that the nation in this narrow sense is an intrinsically modern conception, the nation of the nation state is a modern conception, then you should not think that you will find a nation of the nation state in all parts of history. If you go to ancient India, you go to medieval India, everywhere you go in history, you find the nation of the nation state. I think that is one of the most obvious examples of falling into the European trap of making European history universal, or if you use Dipesh's term, for instance, hyper-real, that is something which actually trumps all historical evidence by just its theoretical power. The interesting thing, which is linked to the discussion about Ambedkar, is about Savarkar's treatment of the Buddha. Those of you who have read The Essentials of Hindutva recognize that he actually makes a very intelligent move. He is very unwilling to think, which you can. Ambedkar sometimes thinks like this. James Mill thinks like that Hindus were always a people, and they were weak people, they were disunited people, etc., and they were defeated by others and things like that. He is not comfortable with that. So he actually places the blame for disunity and ineffectivity in resisting external pressure and things like that to Buddhism. So Buddha's excessive reliance on the principle of nonviolence, which actually disarms you as a people. And so the historical disasters of Hinduism, of the Hindu people as he sees it, it's a very interesting move in which the blame for that disaster is actually displaced onto Buddha and the Buddhists. You can make sense of history in a certain sense that way. So this dissenting tradition, that is the anti-European tradition of thinking about the nation and the state, rejects the European certitude, which I find repeated and accepted in Savarkar and Iqbal kind of argument. The dissenting tradition rejects it in three different ways. First, and this should be clear to you, that the dissenting tradition starts from Bhudev, in my view. There might be other people who have thought about this way, but I simply do not know about them, because I know only the English literature, to some extent, things written in Hindi, and of course Bengali. It's quite possible that somebody writing in Tamil or Telugu or Odia might have actually uttered ideas like this before, which I do not know. But that tradition, the parampara, I call it the parampara because the generations are overlapping. So Bhudev, who is an exact contemporary of Bankim, then Tagore, who is a younger contemporary, Gandhi, slightly younger than Tagore, and then Nehru and others who are much younger. So what I'm trying to say is that this is a corpus of ideas which is developed by people like Bhudev at one point, and then those are developed by the dissenting thinkers later on. But I want to make this point very quickly about this rejection. First, it historicizes the nation-state form and asserts that this is not a natural condition of humanity, but something peculiar to Europe and also to a particular time in Europe. So we should not essentialize Europe either. Secondly, it rejects the moral justification of that kind of nation-state by showing that it is obviously exclusionary. So all the European, for instance, in European states, the Westphalian states, if it was a Catholic state and you were a Protestant community, you might be suffered to exist somehow, but your places of religious observance should not actually look like places of religious observance, right? So that kind of thing, that kind of condition of subordination. So it says that it's exclusionary and rejects its moral justification by saying that. And third, it argues that this is not feasible in India. India in 1946 is not Europe of the period before Westphalia or after Westphalia. So it's a very different history, which gives us very different initial conditions for starting out to make our state. And so therefore, they ask for a kind of, to use Partha Chatterjee's telling phrase, for the simple reason that most of the world is not like Europe. Most of the world has a different kind of history. And therefore, they contest the false universality of the form of the nation state. They believe that these are the two different principles on which you can base the political community of blood and neighborliness, and decide with neighborliness. In talking about neighborliness, you would have noticed that I put a lot of emphasis on the term next. That is, somebody has been placed next to me. And I just want you to see that this idea of who is next, nextness, is something which is potentially an extremely complex and expandable idea. So neighborliness does not necessarily mean, the person who is just next to me spatially. Neighborliness can actually mean that I live in, let's say, Mali, or let's say I live in Bangladesh, and somebody else who lives in Florida, right? We are both threatened by inundation, by the rising sea level. So depending on what the criteria of neighborliness is, neighborliness can actually work in many different directions. It's not just spatial neighborliness. So I have a section in a paper that I'm drafting. There is an elaboration of this idea of nextness in that. And I think you can see the importance of this idea if you look at what is happening in Palestine, because they can look at each other as people who are united by blood and who are also united in a certain sense by this absolutely unending enmity. But also at the same time, they're neighbors. They cannot do without each other. Whatever one does affects the other. So you can, even in fraught situations like this, I think it's always possible to think of it in terms of these two very differently inflected theories of blood and neighborliness. I would dispense with the discussion about Ambedkar. I'll mention only a couple of things. I was writing a paper recently for a conference. Initially, I said to the organizer that I don't want to write about Ambedkar because I don't know very much about him. But then I thought that I should read some and then think of writing something. The conference was on Ambedkar's religion. And I found its extraordinary sentence in the paper called Buddha and Karl Marx. You would recall that the paper is written partly in kind of elaborate prose, and parts of it has just sort of staccato sentences, just bullet points kind of thing. And one of these has two very important things that he notices in Buddhism. This is the first sentence. I think I'm quoting him rightly, short sentence. But I was very surprised by Ambedkar saying that religion is needed in a free society. Just one sentence. Religion is needed in a free society. Why should religion be needed in a free society? And the other thing is that, the clue to the answer to that question is the use of the word society with a capital S. Remember that Ambedkar continually makes this argument that Hindus have no society. There is a society in the obvious sense, obvious minimal sociological sense, but Hindus don't have a society. To show what he means, he capitalizes the S. And you can see influence of Dewey and discussions about democracy and things like that in that. And the second thing, which I found very striking, was that Buddhism is a religion who doesn't have an idea of God and which does not bother about who created the world, for what purpose, etc. So religion is essentially centered on the question, what human beings owe to each other. Now, that's the only thing which is the center of the Buddhist religion. And it's only in that sense that religion is needed for a free society, and society with a capital S. I wouldn't go into it. It's a fascinating discussion because I think it actually tells us that when we look at the question, what is our tradition? We usually have a very lazy, one-sided view of it. And we equate the ancient Indian tradition entirely almost, with the Hindu tradition, ancient Hindu tradition, which is wrong. Because there is also an alternative tradition, very powerful, equally powerful philosophically, equally powerful morally and logically, which we give up on entirely if we do this. So I want to finish now by saying that, there are currently circulating arguments that suggest that the ideas at the basis of our constitution are colonial and therefore seriously faulty. And it is part of this thinking is part of a larger conception of our historical tradition, which I think is inadequate and misleading. Why inadequate? It's inadequate because of what I said just now. It truncates the tradition. It selects some parts of the tradition and it obviates other parts of the tradition, which to my mind are sometimes even more important. Tagore has a very powerful poem on the Buddha, and that actually shows a line of thinking which sees the tradition of ancient India, as being composed of various valuable, lines of thought. One coming from the Upanishad, but also one coming very, very significant from the Buddha. But of course, his emphasis on the Buddha is not as strong as Ambedkar's. It truncates the tradition. So what is available in Sanskrit is not just the world of Hinduism. The world of Sanskrit is not a Hindu world. The world of Sanskrit is a Hindu and a Buddhist world. Not merely Ambedkar, some of recent social scientists have also made that point. D.R. Nagaraj, unfortunately, died very young, and he didn't write very much, except for that very short, very interesting book called The Flaming Feet. Nagaraj made a point which was very similar. Secondly, I think it actually affects a transposition. It presents as colonial the most important themes of successful anti-colonial reflection. As I told you just now, that in my view, the neighborliness side of the Indian tradition of Indian political thought is the truly anti-colonial tradition. That is the tradition which defies the intellectual dominance of the West. The other side of the tradition, the blood side of the tradition, actually submits to the certitudes of Western political theory. So it's because of that, I think, and it is a kind of sad, travestic inversion of what is the true picture of the tradition of Indian political thought. So I'm glad that we have been forced into a critical examination of our intellectual culture because of the recent developments. But I don't see it going in a positive direction because of this. We are simply inventing new forms of intellectual subjection to the West, subjection to the tarnished ideals of European modernity. Under the earlier regime of our intellectual culture, dominated by intellectually submissive Marxists and liberals, both, I think, equally submissive to the dominance of Western tradition, attempts at breaking away from the dominance of European thought, except on the narrow political question of sovereignty, were feeble and faltering. Marxists were waiting for a capitalism of the Western kind to arrive to us in future and unhelpfully designated the past as feudal, mischaracterizing both our past and our future. Liberals simply recited the conditions under which democracy emerged and flourished in Europe and expected, in my view totally unreasonably, the same history to unfold here and to wait for it. Now I fear we're witnessing a more forceful phase of recolonization under a disguise. Hindu Rashtra is only the model of the European nation-state, thinly and unconvincingly covered by a kind of flimsy wrapper of Indian tradition. It's particularly ironic that we have been told that we should emulate the European model of the modern state, when the Western states themselves have recognized the folly and the pity of that misadventure and are trying, not always successfully, to find something which is more pluralistic, acknowledging the horrors that necessarily follow from that strange, tragic, and hubristic attempt to make all human beings identical and uniform, or to conquer the world for the use of only one community, as the West did in the period of colonialism. The logic of blood was based on the rejection of the logic of neighborliness. It's only when we can put this European illusion of the deadly mix of uniformity and domination behind that, to quote a partly forgotten thinker, prehistory will end and human history will begin. Thank you.
You have been listening to BIC Talks by Bangalore International Center. If you like what you heard, do follow us on social media. Keep up with our programming by signing up for our mailer on the website or leave us a review or rating on Apple Podcasts or iTunes. The crew that makes these podcasts possible is Gaurav Krishna and Ishan Gupta on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Sarunaraj and Raghu Tenkaila. Artwork is designed by Chandni Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studio. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcenter.org. This is Lekha Naidu signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.